What part of your inner being is satisfied by a work of art? And why is this satisfaction something we all crave? Subjective as it all is, good art makes us feel more appropriate about ourselves, and bad art makes us feel inappropriate about ourselves. Looking at works from different time periods and different civilizations, you wonder where the strictly enforced values come from that these people rely on for propriety's sake. In medieval China, if you tried to paint landscapes in color, rather than the trademark black and white, were you a social outcast? And in Japan, with their lovely two-dimensional paintings that emphasize flat planes of color and graphic quality that inspired the Western artist Vincent van Gogh, what happened if you tried, as an artist in feudal Japan, to give three-dimensional volume to a painted figure, like a Renaissance portrait? And why are African figurines distorted in their trademark manner? And was it illegal to paint them bright rainbow colors? Then there's the famous tribal masks, the main place where we see African painting. Why don't the pre-colonial Africans paint on flat panels or ladder-day canvases, or create frescoes like the Europeans? Why does it feel inappropriate to even suggest this? Like I'm being rude somehow by saying this out loud. Something about our communal sense of propriety, and what is acceptable for public display. What rules does it follow? Why do values vary so much from culture to culture? When you make something yourself, you instinctively create according to what you need in order to feel appropriate about yourself. No one ever told you specifically to do it this way. It's just what you developed over the years in order to cope with a world that makes you feel so inappropriate about yourself. And hopefully whatever you create can help the rest of us with that very same struggle. Take a visit to the monastery and enjoy a lecture from Sandro Sebastian, the art monk. Here at the Still Life organization, we are always looking for ways to examine the human identity in more creative, abstract ways that validate your self-esteem by determining it a science that just hasn't been discovered yet. There may be antibiotics for bacteria and treatments for physical ailments, but all manner of toxic behavior brought on by human beings and their trademark inferiority complex when they don't get proper instruction on their own identity and how to not take it for granted is a disease that traditional science has yet to cure. The art that people make thus, the music, literature, and performance, all designed to stimulate imagination, inspire, compel, and invigorate, and some might even say, express ourselves, fine, if you like. Any art you make will be based on what you believe people are, and what is at stake with us emotionally, even if you believe the answer to be nothing at all. That is still a belief. You are choosing to see the human identity as a complete social construct. Not saying I recommend that worldview, but we're not here to trade opinions. Anyway, let's ask what happens when something shifts in the world or moves inside of our lives. Some political or social change that reshapes how we perceive the human identity. What happens when a formerly cherished part of our identity starts to look irrelevant due to changing values? It could happen after all. An example that is not so politically charged, just to begin, would be when we chop down nature and build our concrete jungle on top of it. Now, more indigenous cultures of centuries past would look at what we do to nature and not understand how you have the nerve to tear down something that was here before you and will still be here after you, as though you own it. The Native Americans in particular would have asked, how do you own the land? Like you own each blade of grass, you own every leaf on the tree, you own every drop of rain that falls? How do you own something that was here before you and will still be here after you? Get over yourself. A little bit more expressive than a single teardrop, right? So, in our modern concrete jungle, the natural respect that we as humans used to have for nature and humanity's place within it, not able to own it, is a part of the human identity that we believe we've conquered or passed enough laws that kind of thinking no longer has a place in society. We've proven that superstition about nature was a made-up thing the whole time, those silly indigenous people. So from this point onward, all the art, literature, and music that we produce is going to ignore that side of our identity completely, and everything gets a little more superficial and emotionally stunted. Hence the eventual increase in toxic behavior that becomes the new normal. Unless it turns out that the nature-respecting part of our identity was, in fact, a made-up thing the whole time, and we've set ourselves free from outdated superstitions about nature and our place in it. Then there's something like colonialism and or capitalism, where you move into another person's country and hijack the economy and reduce the natives to nothing more than manual labor and siphon the wealth into your own community so you can have a physically higher standard of living and create a manufactured professional environment where I can reserve job opportunities for my retarded nephew at the expense of others who are being deliberately held at a disadvantage in order to pay for all of this. Oh, and make sure to tell them it's their own fault for being naturally inferior, based purely on what they look like. Makes perfect sense. Now, some might point out that there are a lot of components of human civilization and cultural development that are not about doing that. There may be benefits that certain people bring to the table professionally that are not aided by hoarding money or by exploiting others. What a concept. But once this exploitative, abusive system is implemented, that way of looking at the world, seeing people's value in terms of something other than dollars and cents, that part of the human identity starts to look irrelevant to our eyes, as though it was a made-up thing the whole time, and we've finally proven who is the master race. Notice, I didn't say these natural parts of our identity become irrelevant. I said they begin to look irrelevant. And any art or literature or music that you create within your society after that point will ignore that part of our identity, and everything will be a little bit more superficial and emotionally stunted than it was before. And we experience yet another increase in toxic behavior, now don't we? Then there's the science of biology, and how we let random strangers who call themselves scientists tell us what people are on a biological level, regardless of the implications. The theory of evolution in particular, which reduces all life to a mass of molecules that describes us as no more than hyper-intelligent chimpanzees that walk upright and have less body hair. That's it. Nothing more complex than that. No plan, no purpose for our lives, no connection to any almighty judge or overseer, permanently overriding the formerly held idea that our identity was first created in a paradise garden with one man and one woman, each member of that union being not just the first human being that the other had ever met, but the two of you being the first human beings that anyone had ever met, ever. There were no parents, no grandparents, no in-laws, no siblings, and no traumatic childhoods with emotional baggage to bring into adulthood. No former partners or exes to haunt you while in your current relationship. No politics, no government, no racism, prejudice, economic divide. No toxic behavior brought on by someone's inferiority complex. A perfectly emotionally stable environment where one partner had no reason to deceive the other, manipulate, or try to make this all about me. What does the word relationship even mean in that context? Anybody know? In the Garden of Eden, all of that simply hadn't happened yet. It's not as though the toxic behavior was out there in the world somewhere and hadn't found its way to this couple yet. No, it simply didn't exist. There was no such thing as emotional baggage because there was nothing to have emotional baggage about. In this environment is where the human identity was first created, according to this theory, and in which we were meant to live originally. So your psychology is designed to live in that kind of pure environment just described, which is why emotional baggage is so uncomfortable for our mind to deal with in the modern world. It's not natural for us. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Kind of explains a lot now, doesn't it? But if we introduce Charles Darwin and his monkey man theory, where we slowly change from animal to human over millions of years, with no clear divider between a human identity and that of an animal, I beg your pardon, or when the exact crossover happened, and what is the human sense of civility, and why does toxic behavior create emotional baggage? This theory dominating the discussion in the modern world makes the Garden of Eden creationist theory for the origin of the human identity look irrelevant, as though it was a made-up thing the whole time and we finally freed ourselves from it. Notice, I didn't say it makes the theory irrelevant, it just makes it look irrelevant. Well, you can define evidence by what you hold in your hand and examine, look at under a microscope, or define evidence by which explanation answers more questions about what people are and why we behave the way we do. One theory answers more about human biology, the other answers more about human behavior, demeanor, temperament, and self-esteem. I suppose you can decide for yourself which questions are more important to have answers to. Your choice, monkey man. But if that part of our identity looks irrelevant, then from that point onward, all the art, literature, music, and performance that your society produces will be that much more superficial and emotionally stunted. Now, the cultural shifts I've mentioned so far all happened long before we were all here, and before our grandparents were all here. So we can't even estimate what the human identity looked like before those described parts of it started to look irrelevant. At least not until we perform the upcoming exercise, but we'll get to that in a minute. So let's move on to the 20th century, the only century that the majority of us at least have all met in person as of this recording, having arrived within the world at different points in her timeline, and therefore perceiving her differently, but cherishing her for housing the development of our respective personalities nonetheless, and our parents and grandparents who rub off on us. Within this century alone, what parts of the human identity began to look irrelevant right before our very eyes? Well, there's the issue of women's voting rights, access to the workplace, and birth control outside of marriage. Is it getting good? And the ultimate toll it took on the institution of marriage right before our very eyes, a problem we still haven't solved to this day. And I'm not going to let you forget it. The idea of a man taking full responsibility for a woman by way of a legal contract from the state and passing laws to make sure that that contract actually has authority in our lives, small details, and not just a piece of paper, that component of masculinity as an identity marker now looks completely irrelevant, and subsequently makes marriage as an overall part of the human identity, regardless of gender, look completely irrelevant to both groups. Marriage is just a piece of paper that anyone can sign with anyone, and it's all the same. There's nothing special about an adult man choosing to take legal responsibility for women and children, nor any need to pass laws that prioritize that kind of agreement over other kinds of agreements. Okay. Cancel me when you hear some hate speech, please. But the purely masculine view of marriage as an institution now looks irrelevant, as though it was a made-up thing the whole time and we finally liberated ourselves from it. Notice, I didn't say it becomes irrelevant, it just looks irrelevant. So all of the art and literature, performance and music that your society produces from that point onward will ignore that part of our identity, and everything will be a little more superficial and emotionally stunted. And speaking of performance arts, there's a society where most exhibitions of music, dancing or acting, dramatic arts are pre-recorded and broadcast electronically over devices, as opposed to live theater, ephemeral performances without edits or mechanical enhancements of any kind, digital or otherwise. Once upon a time, everything was prepared to be done in one take, if you will, in person, rehearsed extensively for your viewing experience. To our eyes who grow up watching television, movies, and listening to the radio, experiencing that kind of live show is a part of the human identity that now looks irrelevant, as though it was a made-up thing the whole time and we finally outgrown it. So all of the art that you produce in your society from that point onward now ignores that part of our identity, and everything gets a little bit more superficial and emotionally stunted. Now, let's continue the jaunt through the 20th century with the countercultural revolution of the 1960s, brought on by the infamous baby boomers, raised in the cushy post-war economy where everything looks like it magically pays for itself. So growing up and taking responsibility, that part of the human identity begins to look irrelevant. Then there's what happens when someone grows up in extreme privilege and affluence in general, with wealthy, connected parents that can arrange everything for you so that all you have to do is show up and someone is there to put the tools in your hand and point you in the right direction. You never have to stand in line or compete with others or present yourself to a room of strangers who may or may not accept you, and therefore need to create your own advantage. Understanding how to not take it all personally, because these people in this room are not your parents or someone your parents hired. The improvisation that the rest of us have to learn in our daily lives, the hustle and bustle, and learning how to not see yourself as the center of the universe, and compromise with others, be a team player, that part of the human identity never develops in the overindulged, highly sheltered child. Therefore, that part of the human identity to them reads as a blank sheet of paper to those raised in the bubble and looks completely irrelevant. So if you go to a highly exclusive, overpriced art school populated by the sons and daughters of the incredibly wealthy, you can predict what kind of art you'll witness there between the teachers and the students. Now, let's get deeper into the issue here and examine what makes certain kinds of art controversial, from jazz music to rock and roll, and certain genres of film and television that are deemed explicit. Even certain painters like Picasso or Andy Warhol, or certain kinds of technology that change the shape of our lives and make older adults concerned for the future. When some cultural phenomenon sweeps the world and signals that times have changed. Something is popular now that couldn't have been popular one generation ago. Now, what is the problem with falling out of touch with the human identity, you might ask? Well, it's not just a matter of making crappy art from that point onward, but the life skill of determining with accuracy just what people are is how you determine when you're dealing with a toxic person and decide when someone is taking advantage of you. The best example I can use, and not just to get your attention, would be human sexuality and the process by which babies are made. Since we have no other way to make sure the human race doesn't go extinct, these sexual emotions that we all begin to feel in adolescence, in what's called high school, where you're locked in a cage with other adolescents, are a switch that we can't turn off. And since no one knows 100% what these feelings are, especially when you can't read the other person's mind, which is kind of what makes them exciting, we all carry around just a little bit of that insecurity as to the matter. That insecurity, unfortunately, ultimately is how predators manipulate you and coerce you into doing something that you do not have to do. If you don't have a firm grasp on what people are, then you don't know the difference between where babies actually come from and what is just some weirdo that they haven't caught yet. Every single human being on the face of this earth has to decide where one stops and the other begins at some point in their life. Even if you are not married and don't have kids, you have to protect yourself from predators and protect other people around you from potential predators. There's no traditional science or mathematical equation or school curriculum that handles this because it's too subjective and too abstract. So how do you practice this kind of decision making? The science of how people see the human identity inside of their heads. If I might take a minute to sell my product here and remind you why you're watching this, not just for the pleasure of my company, though that is simply a bonus. When people are young, they think the grown-ups are having sex because they really, really like each other. Like it's someone who wants to be your friend and pay you some sort of compliment. Later in life, as we realize after a few missteps, you see that that isn't really the case. Would be nice. See, there are two types of sexual predators. Ones that have sex without consent, and ones that get consent under false pretenses. And the second one is not illegal. Immoral, yes. Illegal, no. So when something happens in the world that makes yet another part of the human identity look irrelevant, like it was a made-up thing the whole time and now we are free from it, the two ends of the spectrum, where babies come from and weirdos we haven't caught yet, start to move towards each other as we lose our ability to discern one from the other. Because we don't know what people are as well as we used to. And it's really fascinating that we as humans all have this weakness for someone who makes some strict set of rules in our lives look like they were a made-up thing the whole time, and I'm the rebellious artist who created something that lets us break those rules. It feels like someone is liberating you. And as we all know, the feeling is highly, highly addictive. It's not beautiful or compelling or enlightening, just highly, highly addictive. So when the older generations say, this rock and roll music is going to lead to fornicating, the younger generations say, with any luck, yes, that's the point. Then the older generations are responsible for saying back, that's not what the other person is doing there. They are not there because they want to be your friend. That's just some weirdo that they haven't caught yet. Why do people think that God hates sex? Because he says to not do it with strangers? Of course God wants you to have sex, because God does not want the human race to go extinct. If he did want the human race to go extinct, it would just happen. God just wants you to find someone that loves you for you, the same way he loves you for you. So no, God doesn't hate sex, he just hates sexual predators. Like a lot. Like a lot. Like totally, completely despises them in any shape or form. Anyone who plays games with this part of your identity, a part that has to always be vulnerable so that the human race doesn't go extinct, man, when somebody messes with it, or manipulates it, or traumatizes it, oh, I tell you, there is no faster way to get onto God's shit list. He doesn't play that. That is not what people are. And between sex and marriage, perhaps it is part of the feminine identity to choose to let a man touch you because he is the one taking full responsibility for you by way of a legal contract with the state. Maybe that's what that part of her identity is for. Another part now made to look irrelevant. Not everyone is a woman or a gay man. Maybe I see things your friends don't see. So I notice that all the art that gets made that abbreviates our view of the human identity makes us more vulnerable to bullies and predators. That's what they mean when they say it leads to fornicating. When you are young, you don't know the difference between where babies actually come from and who is just some weirdo that they haven't caught yet. Blurring the line between the two is very exciting and highly addictive, yes, but ultimately a falsehood. That's not really how being a person works. So let's perform an exercise right here, right now. I'm going to perform the service of the Still Life organization and show you classical works of art from centuries past, made by artists before certain parts of the human identity started to look irrelevant to our eyes. And what we'll do is turn up our imagination dial and deliberately try to see something that our current society doesn't see. We are not looking for something familiar, something highly addictive. No, you won't find that, so don't look for it. We are imagining what people look like when maybe my adult sense of masculinity and my requirement to take legal responsibility for women and children by marriage contract has not yet been undermined, not made to look irrelevant. We're just playing pretend here, mind you. I know, it's a silly idea, right? Who needs that? And let's imagine a world where I've never seen a broadcast version of performance arts or music. Everything is only heard live, prepared for me in full, in person, to be performed in one take, Let's pretend that part of the human identity has not been made to look irrelevant. Wouldn't that be nice? As I said, let's turn up the imagination dial further and pretend like no one's ever heard of the Charles Darwin theory of evolution. We're pretending. And we are nothing more than hyper-intelligent chimpanzees who walk upright and have less body hair. Compelling as that theory is, let's pretend like we are emotionally vulnerable because our identity was designed to live in a perfect paradise where there was no such thing as emotional baggage, hence the difficulty of dealing with baggage and toxic behavior. Let's pretend that that part of the human identity was never made to look irrelevant. Silly, I know, but just humor me. Let's pretend like we actually pass laws to strictly define the difference between where babies actually come from and who's just some weirdo that they haven't caught yet, instead of encouraging the latter group, or some entitled whore who's working a hustle. Let's pretend like no one ever thought there would be any reason to move sex outside of marriage. Because why? Because you're in love? I beg your pardon. Before we decided that the part of your identity that wants to save yourself for someone who actually loves you for you was a made-up thing the whole time, and before we liberated ourselves from that nonsense, because who needs that? Let's pretend we are those silly old-fashioned people that don't see marriage as irrelevant when we look at these paintings. Turn up the imagination dial as high as it goes and look at these forthcoming pieces in that context. They won't look like something that we would make because they're not supposed to. Look for something that is not familiar to us. I promise you can do this. Don't be scared. It's just the human identity. Straight out of the Garden of Eden. It won't bite you. See how beautiful you look? Now, my modern-day Western audiences, I'm going to give you one more exercise. Imagine we live at a time when you would leave your dwelling in the morning and be greeted by the natural growth in the area, not cultivated spaces and paved sidewalks and streets. When you understood that you can't own something that was here before you and will still be here after you, before someone made that part of your identity look irrelevant. And maybe there's no reason to colonize people and shove them out of their own economy after you hijack it, so you can exploit the lower race for their labor and tell them it's their own fault for being inferior. And there are other parts of being human that have nothing to do with doing that. Crazy, right? What if those other parts of the human identity were never made to look irrelevant? Turn up the imagination dial there and look at these. Now, the ultimate joy of being an artist, and not a commercial artist who creates work that is highly addictive only, in order to make a massive profit, the real joy is that you as an individual can look into your fellow man and see what parts of their own identity that the world has damaged, or stolen, or tricked you into thinking is irrelevant. You can see that in someone else and try to create something that validates it all over again. Even if it's not some grand cultural event or shift, like television being invented, or the theory of evolution, or feminism, or rock and roll music, or the internet, something that transforms the world, even if it's the small individual tragedies or life experiences we have in our personal lives that maybe not everyone has, but still lessen our sense of identity nonetheless, and trick you into thinking that some part of your individual personality is no longer relevant, a toxic friend or family member or work environment, something about yourself that you used to cherish, and I can see it weighing on you. Perhaps I, as a stranger, can produce a work of art that reminds you that that part of your identity is not lost. It was always real. The world tricked you into thinking it wasn't relevant. This is a more responsible kind of liberating feeling, not the highly addictive kind, but the deeply invigorating kind. It illuminates you. Now, when you look at the art of Sandro Sebastian, which I hope you do after this video, I can't promise you anything highly addictive, anything with an immediate buzz that leads to fornication. Sorry, no more than this video itself. But I can promise you that if you turn up the imagination dial and look for something unfamiliar to your eyes, you can receive a validation for a part of your identity that the world tricked you into believing was irrelevant. Just in case you're wondering why Jesus forgives, that's the answer to the question. As I said with the Garden of Eden theory, you can decide what questions are more important for you to have answers to. Or maybe we're just all hyper-intelligent chimpanzees with less body hair who walk upright, and the human identity was a made-up thing the whole time. So let's go fornicate. TheArtMonk.com is the personal website of artist and writer Sandro Sebastian. Visit one of my portfolio pages and browse works of art in oil, acrylic, or graphite drawings. Most of my work draws from historical references. I'm not too big on contemporary art created in today's world, a quality I share with many of you out there, I'm sure. You can click on the images for an enhanced view of my technique. It's a more patient approach that's not as immediate as the part of the brain you use when you're, say, watching television or listening to the pop music on the drive to work. If you want a break from that, which we all need, then I'm your guy. When you let another culture or time period speak to you, it reveals parts of your humanity that your contemporary society doesn't. Keeps you fresh. Even going further back to eras that don't exist anymore, you can discover ways of looking at the universe that don't exist anymore. Maybe we're not who we thought we were. A desire to touch and be touched by the past is what drives this artistic practice. The voice of a former era can ring louder than our own voices.